Yeah. I know. I can imagine.
Yeah, the animal would be very much and suffering, but. See. So, yeah. But one of them is 3 or 4 large graphs. Oh, okay. Half of it's the abstract in theory. Oh, and the rest is just, single stuff that it takes a long, so maybe a few hours.
Oh.
It's the graphs, right? Yeah, it's just the graphs and the tables. Well, it makes it longer. You'll figure it out. I believe so. This actually pair with pros in this one. Oh, yeah. You don't see the photos. That is what I'm also saying. That's what it's on. It's related to photos myself. I feel like 2 photos of myself.
Oh, really? Yeah.
All right, it's 4 o'clock. Let's go and get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Good to hear. It's week 6, so I'm sure things are getting busy. Things are getting busy for us too. So we have our midterm exam next week. And I have one more homework for you guys too. So I know homework 2 is still out there. I believe it's due tonight. But I have one more homework to just give you a bit more practice before the exam. And so homework 3 is going to be on, it was posted today, it's going to be due next Monday. Okay. Okay, and so with that, the plan for today is just to keep going with our lecture notes on static analysis. And so I'm hoping we can finish all the lower extremity stuff today, and then Wednesday and next Monday we can cover the spine. Okay. All right, so let's talk a bit more formally about the exam. Okay, so the midterm exam right now is planned for next Wednesday. Okay, so it's going to be in class. So for those of you on Zoom, please plan to be here in class because I'm only going to have paper exams for you. Okay. In terms of content for the exam, basically everything that we've been covering for static analysis will be on the exam, as well as all the tissue biomechanics stuff that we went over, so like bones, muscles, and joints. Right? Okay. The format for the exam, the exam is going to be split into 2 different sections. So the first section is going to be on conceptual questions. And so that will be 4 short answer questions that generally I expect, maybe 2 to 3 sentences to answer them. Okay. Right, so that'll be worth 40% of the points. The other section of the exam is going to be problem-solving questions. And well, we've only gone over one type of problem that you can answer, and so that is static. Basically, I'm going to give you 3 static analysis problems. Okay. And that will comprise the rest of the 60% of the points. Okay. And so it breaks down pretty nicely, actually. So there's basically just enough time in the exam to do 3 of these types of problems. And we're going to cover 3 different areas of the body. So you can probably expect 1 static analysis problem from the upper extremity, 1 static analysis problem from the lower extremity, and then 1 static analysis problem from the spine, which is what we'll cover Wednesday and next Monday. Okay. Now, in terms of what you can bring to the exam, you can bring one sheet of notes. Okay. And so that's just a standard 8.5 by 11 sheet. Okay. You can use both sides. Okay. You can write it or type it, whatever is kind of most comfortable for you. Okay. Now, I allow the cheat sheet for my exams, just mostly just because sometimes there's a lot of equations that go with it, so I let you guys kind of write your own equations. But I also allow you to the reason I give you such a relatively large cheat sheet is that making the cheat sheet is also a good study tool in itself, right? And so if you think about it, we're basically taking basically 6.5 weeks worth of content, and we're putting it all into kind of one exam, right? And so you can also think of it as, taking 6.5 weeks of worth of content and then condensing it into one cheat sheet, right? So that action or that kind of, the process of taking that information and condensing it down into a cheat sheet is actually a really good study tool in and of itself. And so I remember, when I was in school, I would spend the majority of my time, making the cheat sheet itself. And just by doing that, I kind of just very naturally went over all the material that was in the class. And then after I made the cheat sheet, all I basically did after that was just a few more practice problems. And then, that was kind of really effective for me when I was a student. So So I know kind of the temptation with these cheat sheets, especially just because I let you type it, is to just take the notes or take the example problems, make it really, really tiny, and then just copy and paste it onto your cheat sheet. That is a tactic. I can't say that it's a very effective tactic. So I think you'll have much more success kind of writing your own cheat sheet and kind of going over all the information yourself and condensing it yourself. But that's generally what I recommend for that. Okay. The other materials that you can bring for the exam is, of course, you can bring your writing utensil. So pencil, pen, whatever is most comfortable for you. And a calculator. Okay. In terms of calculations, you shouldn't have to expect anything beyond just kind of basic arithmetic. So we've been doing kind of static analysis problems for a while. So you can kind of see it's basically just a bunch of algebraic calculations. Okay. But a calculator is really useful to have, just to make those computations more efficient. Okay. Let's see what else. So you have the full 75 minutes. Oh, there's a study guide that's online. Okay. And so if you go under, I think this is week 6. Okay. If you go into the week 6 page there, if you go scroll to the bottom, you'll see that I've uploaded a study guide to help you with the study. Okay. So the study guide is mostly useful for the conceptual questions. And so when I'm writing the conceptual questions, I basically go within that realm. Sometimes I'll take a question straight from the study guide, but it'll be interpolated within that thing. So I never go outside what's in the study. Okay. So usually what I recommend to people, besides spending a good amount of time making your cheat sheet, is use the study guide to help guide you. That'll help kind of filter a lot of the information and kind of narrow down your focus from the lecture notes, because we've gone over a lot. And then in terms of practice problems, the homeworks are your kind of your best bet. Okay. So for the exam, I'm going to be writing fresh problems, but the brain where all the problems is coming from is the same brain that wrote the homeworks. And so if you kind of get used to kind of the way that I write homework problems and the style, and you get used to the way I draw figures, then you'll be in good shape for the exam. Okay. All right. Any questions on the exam? Yeah.
For the study guide, are we able to take some of the homework problems and put it onto a study guide?
Sure. Yeah, people have done that. And so if you want to write, take your own homework solutions and put that on your cheat sheet, that's great too. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The only thing I don't allow on the cheat sheet are the answers to the exam themselves. But that is impossible because I'll probably be writing the exam the day before the exam. So unless you can tell the future, then well, if you can tell the future, you have better things to do than take this class. But all right.
So other than that, though, there's no limitations to what we can and cannot put.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. Any other questions on the exam coming up? Okay. All right. So let's pick up where we left off last Wednesday. Okay. So I forgot until just about 10 minutes ago that our last lecture was cut short because of the projector and light bulb kind of burned out. But I think the projector and light bulb was working for you guys, because 5 minutes after everyone left, the projector and light bulb came back on. But everyone had already left at that point. Okay. So what we were covering last Wednesday was lower extremity biomechanics. And so, this kind of follows along, right into our kind of our pattern right now, going over the different parts of the body and performing static analysis. Okay. And so remember, when we do static analysis on different parts of the body, we're mainly interested in kind of two things, right? Right. So almost always in these types of problems, we're interested in computing some kind of muscle force that's in the system. And almost always there's going to be some joint reaction forces, usually either one or two components of it. Okay. So this entire unit is pretty much just kind of a repeat of statics and rigid body, mechanics, right? So we have these parts of the body, they're undergoing, they're being subjected to a certain amount of forces, and we want to compute these forces using the equilibrium equation. So some of the forces and some of the moments, basically. Okay. Now for this section, we're interested in the lower body. Okay. And where we left off last time was we were doing an example of the hip joint. Okay. And so what we were saying is that during normal kind of walking motion, there's a point during the motion where you have only one foot on the ground, right? So we're gonna go a bit more in depth into what's called gait biomechanics later in the class, but there's always a point where you have kind of one foot on the ground, and just for the sake of balance, that foot has to be centered on basically your center of gravity. It only happens for just a very brief moment, but if you actually kind of watch someone walking kind of and you watch them closely, there's a point during the motion where this occurs. Okay. And so I'm just going to draw one leg. Okay? And so just because of the geometry of the leg and the geometry of the hip joint, your leg kind of reaches a point where it's kind of slanted so that you can achieve balance where your foot's right on the center of gravity, but your hip joint is kind of off to the side of it too. Okay. So it looks something like this. And so if we draw kind of this dotted line right here. So this dotted line here, that's our center of gravity. Or it's a line that aligns with our center of gravity. Okay. In order to achieve balance, our foot has to be planted right on that line. Okay. But because of our hip joints kind of off to our side, our leg kind of does a little something like this. Now I'm going to exaggerate it a little bit just for the figure, but there's always some kind of slant to it, or always some kind of lean. Okay? That's quite a bit exaggerated, but you get the point. So up here is the hip joint. Okay. And one muscle that actually has to work really hard during your normal walking motion is your hip abductor muscles. Okay. So we did an example last time of these muscles, and so those muscles kind of attach on the outside of your hip joint, just like that. Okay. And just to make sure that you maintain balance and your whole body doesn't go toppling, right? These hip abductor muscles have to contract, quite a bit and apply quite a bit of force in this kind of very simple motion right here. Okay. You can probably see it illustrated the best when, if you watch someone kind of stand on one foot, okay, then you kind of see that exaggerated slant of the lower of your legs. Okay. Okay. So this is pretty typical. So, this is a pretty typical motion, a pretty typical stance that most people are able to do. Okay. Now what happens when you get older is that, your hip abductor muscles start to get weak, right? And that could also happen when someone just ends up injuring their hip abductor muscles as well. Okay. So when the hip abductors are weakened or injured, what tends to happen for these people is that they have a hard time kind of keeping balance and kind of maintaining their stance, and they often have a hard time walking as well. It could either be that the muscle is weakened to the point where it can't exert enough force in order to keep balance. Or if it's injured, having those hip abductors contract will cause the patient a lot of pain. Okay, whatever the reason, there are times when your hip abductor muscles will be compromised, and that causes problems with your balance and with your walking motion. Okay, and so in these situations, these people need some kind of external support in order to maintain balance and maintain usual locomotion. And so the most common way to do this is with the help of some kind of cane or walking stick. What's interesting about this is that, usually when someone is feeling pain in their hip, right? So let's say that they have pain on their left hip, right? And so kind of the intuitive thing that people think is that, all right, my left side is hurting, I should put a cane on that side to help me walk. But actually the opposite is true, right? And so when you have an injured hip, the goal is to try to alleviate as much force or as much load from that hip as possible. And so actually the best way to do this is to apply the walking stick or the cane on the opposite side of where the injury is. Okay. And so what that's going to do is that it's going to kind of straighten out your leg a little bit, so you can maintain balance without such an exaggerated slant of your leg. Okay. And so let me kind of show you a picture of this. Okay. So let's say that this is the center of gravity again. Okay. Now, if someone's hurt on the left side of the screen right here, right? Usually what the doctor will tell you is that, you should use a walking stick kind of on the other side. Okay. So that right there is the walking stick or the cane. Okay. And so the walking stick does a couple of things. So on the one hand, it alleviates some of the force that your legs have to bear. Okay. And so from this, you'll be able to alleviate some of the body weight. Right. So instead of all the force being driven up your leg, some of that force will be kind of offloaded into the walking stick, right? Usually it's a fairly minor amount of force because, most of your weight is kind of in your torso below, and you can only put so much weight on the walking stick, which is held by the upper extremity, right? But it does help, right? And so anywhere between, maybe 20–30% of your weight, you can often offload to the walking stick. Okay. The main benefit though is that it takes your leg and it relieves a lot of stress on the hip joint, so that your leg is a lot more straight. Okay? So no longer is your foot required to be right at the center of gravity. Your foot can be offset a bit here, right? There's still a little bit of a slant usually, but it's usually not that severe. Okay. So here is your foot. Up here is your hip abductors. Okay. And so a lot of the stress, a lot of the force that the hip abductors had to do previously is now relieved, right? Because now to maintain balance, right, your leg is a lot more straight up and down. And so a lot of that weight bearing can go just straight up through the bones. And so the bones are in a much better position now to bear the weight as opposed to. Okay. And this kind of stance right here is pretty, basically the same as what would happen if you're standing up on two legs, right? So if you're standing up on two legs, generally your center of gravity is right in between your two legs. your legs can be kind of relatively straight up and down. And so a lot of the force is being kind of taken on by the bones, right? As opposed if you're standing on one leg, then, a lot of it's on your hip abductors. Okay. Okay, so I have another example here to kind of show you the difference in those in the force. So we can put some numbers on this. Are there any questions on this concept here? Okay, all right. So let's do an example, and let's see how this affects the amount of force. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to draw a free body diagram here of the entire leg, but the focus is going to be on the hip joint. Okay. All right. Okay, so here is our leg. Right here will be our hip joint. Okay. The hip joint is always a little bit of a strange joint to do calculations on because it is kind of offset from the end of the femur because the femoral head is so big, right? So this little offset right here is purely just because of the femoral head. Okay. So this point right here would be kind of the end of the thigh or the upper end of the thigh that you would kind of associate with that. And then you have to travel a bit of distance in order to get to the hip joint. Okay? All right, so you don't have to write that femoral head, but I just kind of want to let you know that that's what the offset is for. Okay. Okay, but the end point here is pretty significant because this is where the hip abductor kind of attaches. Okay. So we have FM. So FM is the muscle force associated with the hip abductor joint. Okay. We have the joint reaction forces at the hip joint. Okay. So we have JX, or excuse me, that's JY. That's JX. Okay. All right. So now we need some dimensions here, and this is where things get a little bit complicated. Okay. Okay. So, sorry, keep getting distracted by High School Musical out there. Right. Okay. Let me put in the normal force from the ground. Okay. And so this normal force here is going to represent the weight of the person's body. And so the person's body weight is going to be pushing down to the ground, and the ground pushes back a normal force with an amount of 200 newtons in this case. Okay. We have a line here that's going to be associated with the where the hip joint is. Okay. So that line going straight down, that's a line with the hip joint itself. Okay. This distance in between this line and the ground reaction force, we'll call that LF. Okay. We have the weight of the leg, and so we're going to assume the weight of the leg is acting right here. And so just by the dimensions given, you can tell that we're gonna sum the moments around the hip joint. And so just to make things easier, I'm giving you this horizontal distance right here. And so the horizontal distance between where the weight of the leg is acting and kind of that vertical line where the hip joint is, we'll call that LL. Okay. All right. And so we have a few dimensions here at the top too, because we need to know the moment arm for the muscle force. So I'm going to actually break this down into kind of two directions here. Okay. And so what I'm going to do, So that horizontal distance between where the muscle force acts and the distance to that kind of dotted line, I'm going to call this LM. Okay. And then that vertical distance is going to be HM. So let me draw kind of I'll draw a bigger version of that just because it's a little bit hard to see up there, but you know, I kind of drew that just to make it a bit convenient for us to compute that number. Okay. Okay. And now we have the angles here. So we have the angle of the muscle force with respect to the horizontal. So that angle right there is going to be 70 degrees. And then the other angle that we need here is the angle that the leg makes with the horizontal, which is 85 degrees. Now, you know, the way I drew it, it looks a bit slanted. That's just so that I could fit all the dimensions within the figure. But remember, the whole point of using the walking stick is so that your leg can be much straighter up, right? And so you can see here, we're in a position where, you know, the leg is almost completely vertical because we have the help of that walking stick. Okay. Okay. So let me kind of draw this figure over here, just because there's kind of a lot going on there. Okay. Okay, so we have the hip joint here. And so at the hip joint, we have our joint reaction forces JY and JX. Okay. And then we have our muscle force out here, okay, FM. And the way I kind of characterize, so the way I kind of characterize the distance between the muscle force and the joint is I kind of broke that up into two components. And so there's a horizontal distance. So this distance right here will be consistent with the coloring. So that horizontal distance is LM. And this vertical distance right here, we'll call it HM. Okay. All right. And this angle right here is 70 degrees. Okay, so what I drew there, that was just kind of a blown up version of what's in that circle. Okay, just because it's a little bit hard to, there's kind of a lot going on there. Okay. One other thing that I'll note here, that'll be important for us when we're computing the moments is that all angles that are displayed here, so the 70 degrees and the 85 degrees, those are all angles with respect to the horizontal. Okay. So that's a little bit different than what we're used to as well. So if you remember from all of our examples in the upper extremity, you know, usually when I define the muscle angle, it's usually with respect to the limb itself. But because we have this kind of weird situation with the femoral head, you know, I just gave you the angle with respect to the horizontal. Okay. Okay. This figure is always my least favorite just because it takes so long to explain, right? But you know, nothing else is really different from this. And so we're going to take this problem here. And so we're going to compute the muscle force and the joint reaction forces. Okay. All right. Any questions on just the geometry for the problem? Okay. All right. So just like we usually do, you know, the first thing that we're going to do in this problem is we are going to use the moment equation, and we're going to use the moment equation to compute the muscle force. Okay, so let's sum the moments, and we're going to sum the moments around the hip joint. And so we need to factor in all of our forces here. Okay, so we have three forces here that we need to account for in our moment equation. So we have the muscle force, we have the weight of the leg, and we have the ground reaction force from the ground. Okay. Let's do the contributions from the weight of the leg and the ground reaction force first. Okay. And so we just come back up to this figure right here. We can see the weight of the leg, both the weight of the leg and the normal force are both vertical forces. Okay. And so to compute their moments, we need to multiply them by the horizontal distance between the force vectors and the joint itself, which is exactly kind of what's conveniently given to you in the problem. Okay. Okay, so let's start with the weight of the leg. Okay. And so the moment that's caused by the weight of the leg around the hip joint is going to be the product of the weight of the leg multiplied by its moment arm, which is LL. Okay. Of course, you know, the thing we also need to determine is the sign of this moment, right? And so if we look at this force up here and we look at the joint, we can see that this force is producing a counterclockwise moment. Okay? And so if we continue to trace that around, it's going to go counterclockwise. And so we're going to keep that positive. Okay. Okay. And then same thing for the normal force from the ground, right? So the normal force from the ground, it's on the other side and it's vertical. And so if you kind of trace this out, you know, again, we're kind of going in this counterclockwise direction, right? And so we're going to have plus 200 newtons multiplied by LF. Okay. One thing I realized I forgot is that, you know, all the other parameters here, all the lengths and the weight of the leg, you know, there are measurements for this. I just forgot. So we'll plug in the numbers at the end. Okay. So for now, it looks a little bit strange to have 200 newtons next to a bunch of variables, but you know, the other variables will have numbers as well. Okay. Okay. All right. And so the other moment that we need to determine here is from the muscle force itself. Okay. Now this gets a little bit tricky because you know normally what we are used to is we're taking FM and we're multiplying it by a certain length. Okay. And that length being kind of the perpendicular distance between the muscle force and the joint itself. Okay. But if you look at in terms of how the direction for FM is defined here, you know, FM's direction here is defined with respect to the horizontal, right? And in fact, in terms of the distances that we're given, you know, the distances we're given here are a perfectly vertical component in HM and a perfectly horizontal component in FM. Okay. And so in this case, you know, the way that we can actually compute the contribution to the moment is if we actually take FM and then if we break this up into its X and Y components. Okay. Okay. And the reason we're doing that here, and you know, the reason we usually don't do this because you know, usually when we're given the direction of FM, it's given, you know, we're given an angle with respect to the body part itself. Okay. But we're in this kind of weird situation where in this case, we have FM defined with respect to the horizontal. Okay. Okay. So you won't see this too often, basically the only place that we see this really is in the hip, but just something to be aware of. So it's kind of a small, caveat, but it does actually make a big difference in terms of how you solve the problem. Okay, and so if we break FM up into its two components, right? And so because that angle is given to us with respect to the horizontal, the x component of FM is going to be FM cosine of 70 degrees, okay? And the y component will be FM sine of 70 degrees, okay? Okay. Each of these two components here are going to contribute to the moment equation. So we have to kind of account for both of them. Okay. But this actually makes things a bit easy because to compute the moment arm, you have to multiply by a perpendicular distance, right? And so for FM cosine 70 degrees, we're going to multiply by a horizontal distance. Okay. And so coming back up to the moment equation up here, okay, we're going to have FM cosine of 70 degrees. Okay. The vertical distance between the joint and this FM cosine 70 degrees is HM. Okay. So we have FM cosine 70 degrees times HM. Of course, we need the direction now, right? So we need to know whether this is going to make a positive or negative contribution. Okay. And so if we go up here, okay. And so if we draw kind of a horizontal line that originates from the point where the muscle attaches, and we kind of follow this around, we can see that that is a counterclockwise moment. Okay. So that is also going to be a positive contribution to the moment equation. So we have a plus FM cosine 70 degrees times HM. Okay. And then our other component, FM sine of 70 degrees. Okay, that's the vertical component. We're going to multiply that by a horizontal distance, which in this case is L dash M. Okay. And then we need the direction of this one as well. We can kind of tell the direction just by process of elimination here, just because all the directions of these forces must be kind of set, and so we need to have one kind of opposite component here because they can't all be positive, right? Because this has to equal 0. And so just by process of elimination, we know that this last component here has to be minus. Okay? But let's confirm that just to be sure. Okay, and so if we draw the vertical component of FM right here, right? And we kind of trace that around of the joint itself, we can see that's going in the clockwise direction. Okay. And so by being clockwise, then that sign right there is going to be negative. Okay. Okay, so that is our moment equation here. Okay. The way we formulated it, there should only be one unknown, which is the muscle force, which we can solve for from this equation. Okay. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay. All right, so from here, it's just algebra. So, we're going to move everything that's not FM to one side of the equation, everything with FM to the other side. Okay. And so just for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and skip through the algebra. Okay. And so it's just kind of simple algebra here to solve for FM. And what we get from this is, well, if you plug in all the other numbers that I didn't give you. And so let me see. So LM here is 7 centimeters. LL is 6.5 centimeters. LF is 5 centimeters. HM is 1 centimeter. And the weight of the leg is 50 newtons. Okay. So I try to keep things pretty consistent with the example that we did last time in terms of measurements. Okay. Because the only thing that's different in this case is that, you know, we have that kind of walking stick to kind of help us. And so that all that really did was kind of straighten your leg. Okay. And so if you run the numbers through, what you get is FM is equal to 212.48 newtons. Okay. All right, and so if you compare this to our previous example, and so if you remember from, if you still have your notes from last time, you know, what we got for the muscle force in that case was almost 900 newtons. And so, you know, just by adding that walking stick and not even offloading that much force to it, so we only offloaded 50 newtons, but just by the act of kind of straightening that leg, you know, we've alleviated basically 75% of the force that was being applied on that leg. All right, and so that is our moment equation. Okay. And so from here, you know, you can take the exact same free body diagram, and we can do the sum of the forces in the x direction, sum of the forces in the y direction. That's going to give you the joint reaction forces. Okay. So those are pretty straightforward. You know, in fact, you know, we've actually already broken up FM into its x and y components. And so since we know the value of FM itself, you know, solving for these, those should be pretty straightforward. So, you know, again, kind of in the interest of time, I am going to skip that just so we can move on to the next example. But just know that you can do that as well. And what you're going to find is that if you do compute those joint reaction forces, they are going to be significantly reduced compared to our first example that we did last Wednesday. Okay, and that's the whole point, right? So the whole point is to you know, the whole point of kind of getting a walking stick to aid you is to relieve a lot of the force and a lot of the tension that's being applied at the hip joint. Okay. But just remember that, you know, the interesting thing here is that the walking stick is always on the opposite side of where your injured hip is. Okay. Okay. Any questions on this before we move on to another example? Okay. All right, so that's the hip joint, and so, you know, hip joint, very fascinating. You know, it's becoming very common nowadays that, you know, older folks are getting surgery or some kind of treatment to kind of help with their hip, because, you know, the hip abductors are kind of, you know, one of the first muscles to really kind of fail you in old age. So this is, you know, starting to become more and more relevant. Let's move down. So let's move down to the knee. So the knee, also a very, very fascinating joint. You know, I believe we talked about last Wednesday that the knee is mostly held together by ligaments, right? So more so than any joint in the body, your knee has very kind of strong ligaments, and your knee actually relies on those ligaments very strongly to kind of help stabilize the joint itself. Okay. So let's look at the knee in kind of a relatively stable position. So let's examine the knee during a what's called a leg raise exercise. Okay. So if you're kind of unfamiliar with the leg raise exercise, you sometimes you can do it seated if you want, but oftentimes it's done kind of when you are well, for the knee joint, it's mostly done when you're sitting. So let's draw that. And so your thigh is going to be something like this. Okay. This right here is going to be your knee joint. Okay. And so your lower leg will be something like this. Okay. And your foot is down here. Okay. All right, so the muscle that we're going to be looking at in this case is going to be your quadriceps muscle. So your quadriceps muscle attaches on the front of your lower leg. Okay. And so actually, let me draw the center line of the lower leg like this. Okay. And so your quadricep muscle is going to attach kind of right, it kind of attaches right past the kneecap. Okay. It kind of pulls upward on the lower leg, just like that. Okay. You can do a leg raise exercise without any external weights, but you can also wear, like a weighted boot. Okay. And so the external forces that we have applied here, we'll assume that we have the weight of the leg right here. Okay. And we'll assume that there's some kind of weight on your foot as well. Okay, so that can just be the weight of the foot by itself, or it can be the weight of some kind of weighted boot as well. Okay. Okay, so now we need physical dimensions here. Okay, so first angle that I'm going to give you here is, let me give you the angle, the attachment angle for the muscle. Okay, so this will be theta m. Okay. This is a little bit more traditional here, and so you can see this theta m is defined with respect to the lower leg. Okay. So this is kind of more typical, compared to the last example where we were giving kind of a weird angle. Okay. All right, so we have this attachment distance as well. So the distance between the knee joint and where the muscle force attaches, we'll call this LM. Okay. We have the distance between the knee joint and where the weight of the leg acts, so we'll call that LL. Okay. And then we have the distance from the knee joint all the way down to the foot. Okay. And so we'll call this LW. Okay. So all the distances that are given here, you can see that they're distances from the knee joint to a certain force vector, and they're all measured along the lower limb. Okay. So, for these problems, and I think, most people kind of figure this out too, that, the the trickiest thing about these problems is just kind of getting squared away in terms of, what's given to you, what angles are given to you, and how do you factor that into equations. And so, if it helps, because a lot of times, when you have problems, this kind of information is not explicitly given to you. Sometimes it helps to kind of, write it down, just to say, I'm given this angle, what two vectors is it given between, okay? Or I'm giving these distances and what coordinate system am I measuring these distances, okay? It kind of helps just to organize things, just because, these figures can get pretty busy with all the vectors and the distances and stuff. And so, it always pays to just be a little bit organized. Okay. And so the last piece of information that we need here is the angle of the lower leg itself, okay? Okay, so I'm going to change the color for this because this is an angle that's given with respect to the horizontal, okay? Okay. And so that angle there that the leg makes with the horizontal, we'll call it theta leg, okay? Okay. And then, of course, the other thing that we're interested in at the knee joint is the force joint force in the x direction, so call that Jx. And the joint force in the y direction, J. Okay. Okay, but our goal here is the same. So we have our three unknowns. And so our three unknowns are the muscle force and the two joint reaction forces. And so we want to use our equilibrium equations here to solve for their values. Okay. Any questions on the setup of the problem? Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and write out the equations. So once again, just like we usually do, let's start with the moment equation. Just because we know the moment equation is going to eliminate Jx and Jy, so we'll be able to solve the moment equation straight up for Fm. Okay. So let's sum the moments around the knee joint. Okay. So we'll have three contributions to this equation here. So we have the muscle force itself and our two weights. Okay, so we're going to have three terms here. Okay. All right, so let's start with the muscle force. And so the muscle force. Okay. So, this setup here is more traditional, right? And so, to compute a moment, we need two things, right? We need the component of the force that's going to be driving the moment, and we also need the moment arm for that respective force. Okay. And so if we look at this this force right here, right? This Fm kind of attaches directly onto the line that's kind of given to us from the lower leg, right? And so if we break this Fm up into two components, right? And we can break it up into two components based on theta m. Okay. So we're going to have an Fm cosine theta m and Fm sine of theta m. Okay. Okay. But because, theta m here is given to us with respect to, that's the angle between the force vector and the lower leg, right? One of these components here is going to be completely parallel to that lower leg and then kind of drive itself directly into the knee joint. Okay? And so that component here is going to be Fm cosine theta m. Okay? Whereas Fm sine theta m is going to be perpendicular to the lower leg. All right, and so what do we remember? And so if our force component is going to be driven right into the joint itself, we know that one's not going to contribute to the moment, right? And so we know right off the bat that the Fm cosine theta m is not going to contribute to the moment at all because it's parallel to the leg, so it's driven right into the joint. Okay? And so the only component of this force that's going to contribute to the moment is Fm sine theta m. So let's include that into the moment equation. Okay. And then we need the moment arm for this force, right? And so if we visualize Fm theta m, let me use pink here just to make it stand out a bit more. Okay. All right. And so in pink right here, this is Fm sine theta m. Okay. Right. We need the perpendicular distance between that force component and the joint itself, right? Which is conveniently given to us in the problem, which is just Lm. And then we need the sign for this moment here, right? And so if we look at the sign of Fm sine theta m, we can see that it produces a counterclockwise moment if we kind of trace it around the joint. And so this moment contribution here is going to be positive, right? Fm sine theta m Lm. Okay. Next, we need the contributions from the weights. And so we have the weight of the leg. Oops. And so we have weight of the leg multiplied by its moment arm. Okay, so the moment arm is L. Okay. Now this weight of the leg here is a vertical force. And so the moment arm that we need to multiply it by is the horizontal distance between the force and the joint. Okay. So based on the geometry of this figure here, we can see that LL here is a distance along the leg, but that distance is a slanted distance, right? And so if we draw our kind of our triangle, that looks like this. Okay. Right. The horizontal distance in this case is going to be LL cosine of theta leg. And if we draw the moment, if we kind of trace around the moment here, you can see that it produces a clockwise moment, right? So it's going to go clockwise around that joint. So it's going to be negative. Okay. And then the moment contribution from the weight at the end of the foot will be the same thing. And so it's going to be a minus sign because it's a weight. And so you have W. Now the distance between the weight at the end is LW cosine theta L. Okay. So now we have this algebraic here equation here for Fm. Okay. And so you know just like typical cases here, everything in this equation is given except for Fm. Okay. So if we plug in some typical values, so some typical values here. So let's say the weight of the leg here is 50 newtons. The weight itself is 150 newtons. LL here is 22 centimeters. LM is 12 centimeters. LW here is 50 centimeters. Okay. Theta M here is 15 degrees. Okay. Now that is pretty small, that's right. And so, you know, the quadricep muscle acts pretty parallel to the lower leg. Okay. And let's assume our leg here is at an angle of 45 degrees with respect. Okay. All right, so you plug all that in, and what we get is Fm is equal to 1958 newtons. Okay. All right, so you can see this is fairly big, you know, for a fairly benign exercise. You know, it looks like this person is wearing some kind of weighted boot. Okay, the quadriceps has to exert a very large amount of force, right? Now this isn't uncommon, right? And so we kind of saw this kind of force amplification last Wednesday when we did kind of the unencumbered hip joint, right? But it still is kind of, you know, surprising to kind of see this. But unlike the hip joint, you know, the primary reason why this force is so high is because this attachment angle is actually very low. Okay? And so because of the way the quadricep muscle attaches to the lower leg, you know, it doesn't have a very large attachment angle. So it's basically almost parallel. And so because of that, you know, your quadricep muscle has to work pretty hard in order to, you know, do an exercise like this. Okay. And, you know, it's really, you know, kind of just a consequence of the geometry of your body. If you look at your quadricep muscle is one of those muscles that actually crosses over multiple joints, right? So your quadricep muscle acts at the hip joint, right? And so it has to kind of attach up near the pelvis. But it's also kind of responsible for moving your lower leg as well. And so it's a muscle that kind of goes all, kind of basically attaches all through the front of your thigh. Okay. And so that geometry, the fact that it's so parallel to your legs, really puts it at a disadvantage. And so your quadricep muscle has to work very hard in order to, produce any kind of, rotation. Okay. But the quadriceps actually has help, from another part of your body as well. Okay. So if this part of your body wasn't there, then your quadricep would actually have to work even harder. Okay. Okay. And so that part, that part there might surprise you because, for the most part, this body part is pretty passive. It is important, it's important for protecting your knee, but, a lot of people don't really associate it all that much as being an important body part, which is your kneecap. Okay? So the patella bone. Okay. Although most people think of the patella as something that is there just to kind of protect the front of the knee, so it's just kind of almost just like almost like a protective pad, and that is true. That is its main goal. That is its main responsibility. But another kind of benefit for the patella bone is that it kind of helps to increase that attachment angle to the lower leg. Okay? Okay. So if you draw the anatomy of someone's leg, so this is if you look at someone's leg from the side and you kind of take an X-ray, it kind of looks something like this. Okay? And so if we draw kind of the tibia here, okay? So the tibia here kind of has this kind of plateau look, and it kind of looks something like that. Okay. So this right here is the tibia. The patella is kind of this almost like pebble-looking bone that kind of attaches to the front of the knee like this. Okay. So of course, the patella is not just floating in space. It's attached to ligaments and tendons that kind of keep it together. Okay. But one particular muscle that attaches, that kind of goes over the patella is the quadricep muscle, right? And so if I draw the quadricep muscle, it kind of goes over the patella and attaches to something like that. Okay. So the fibers kind of run over the top of the patella, and then there's the tendon there. Okay. All right. And so the muscle attachment angle, the one that we just did for the problem, probably looks something like that. All right. But you can see from this patella here that it plays a very important role. So it almost kind of acts like a pebble in kind of a stream, where the muscle has to go around the patella to attach to the tibia. Okay? And because it has to go around the patella, it kind of necessarily has to kind of redirect that angle so that your attachment angle is steeper than if it wasn't there. Okay? And so if I draw this angle right here, so theta m here, the attachment angle is actually increased a little bit due to the presence of the patella. Okay. It's very slight, and so it only adds maybe about maybe 5-6 degrees of angle. But for a muscle that is otherwise very highly parallel to the bones, just that little bit of increase actually makes a big difference. Okay. Okay. All right. Any questions on this? Okay. All right. So actually, there is one more example in the notes that has to do with the ankle joint. Although we are very quickly running out of time, so I'm going to skip that that example on the ankle joint for now. But it is in the posted notes online. Okay. But one thing I did want to do before we end today is I did want to talk about common injuries of the lower extremity. So let me go ahead and switch my screen here. Oops. Okay. So switch to slideshow here. Okay, so just for the last 10 minutes today, let's talk about some common injuries that can occur in the lower extremity. Okay, and so just like we did before, we're going to go from the hip to the knee down to the ankle. Okay, so let's start with the hip. So even though the hip, we've talked about is a relatively strong and stable joint, it's still vulnerable to injury, just like any other joint. And this is especially true for the elderly and for those that are active in sports. Okay, so the first type of injury that can occur are fractures. And so what's common is because, this femoral neck here can kind of, there's kind of a part there where it kind of thins out. If you have kind of weak bones, and so if you have like osteoporosis, you can get fractures or sometimes, hairline fractures in that neck. And so that can cause a lot of pain for people and a lot of loss of balance. Okay. Another common injury at the hip is actually doesn't really have to do with geometry. It's just contusions. And so contusions are just simply, bruises. Okay. And so the front side of your thigh is often very susceptible to sustaining kind of large impacts, especially if you play sports or if you're just clumsy like me, you just walk into things just regularly, you just kind of give yourself kind of dead legs. And so, you kind of it gets bruised a lot. Okay. And the other common injury is a hamstring strain. So the hamstring, we didn't really talk about the hamstrings all too much, but the hamstrings is kind of the very large muscle that's kind of on the back of your thigh. Okay. And so your hamstring can get hurt quite a lot, especially if you're in a certain position where your hip is flexed and your knee is extended. You kind of put your hamstring in kind of a vulnerable state because your hamstring is kind of overstretched at that point. And so any kind of extreme movement, or if you kind of do that very quickly, can cause some straining, which is tearing or damage to those muscles. Okay, so those are the most common injuries at the hip. But for the most part, you're probably looking at kind of the elderly population that are having problems with their hip. Okay, so let's look at the knee. So there's quite a few injuries that can happen at the knee, especially if you play sports. Okay, and so remember we talked last Wednesday about all the ligaments that hold your knee together. So we have the ACL, the PCL, and the MCL. Okay, and so these are often pretty injured frequently in sports, and it can often be pretty, you'll be out for a while because those ligaments don't get a lot of blood flow. So it's kind of hard for your body to repair those. Okay. And so probably the most common and also the most devastating are ACL injuries. Okay. So remember, ACL stands for the anterior cruciate ligament. And so that's a ligament that kind of crosses on the inside of your knee and kind of attaches from back to front. Okay. What's interesting about these injuries is that a lot of them are what's called non-contact injuries. So these are injuries that occur, when no exterior force is being applied. Those are injuries that occur just because the athlete or the person is just kind of doing something with their own body. Okay, so a lot of times ACL injuries occur when your foot is planted. Okay, and so your foot is usually firmly planted on the ground. Either you're trying to change directions, and so you're trying to kind of cut really quickly or something like that. Okay. And so usually what occurs is that your foot is planted and you try to move your body in a certain direction. That causes shearing force in your knee in a certain direction that is not very well supported. Okay. Because usually what happens is that the ACL and the PCL kind of work together to kind of give your knee a lot of stability. But if you kind of twist it or move it in a certain way, where only one of those ligaments is taking all that force, that's usually when injury can occur. Okay. And it just so happens that, for most people, when, it just, you kind of put yourself in a position where the ACL is kind of isolated much more often than the PCL. And so ACL injuries are quite common, and they often occur when mostly for athletes that are kind of, planting and trying to change directions. Okay. PCL injuries can also occur, but they're a little bit less common just based on just the typical actions that people take. But generally, when PCL injuries occur, it's when the knee is hyperextended and the foot is plantar flexed. Okay. The other ligament in the knee that's very commonly injured is the MCL. So the MCL is the medial collateral ligament. Okay. And so this is often injured in contact sports. And what happens that if, if your knee is kind of hit from the outside, kind of like what's going on here, then what happens is that this ligament that kind of supports the inner side of the knee kind of right here, okay, this ligament will get stretched and often get injured, in the worst case, be torn, okay? Okay, so the other common injury that can occur is a meniscus injury. So the meniscus, remember, is kind of this little soft pad of kind of cartilage that's kind of on the bottom of your knee, okay? But this is also kind of susceptible to tearing because all of the ligaments here attached to the meniscus, and what can happen sometimes is that the ligaments can actually tear a piece off of that meniscus. Okay. Okay. Any questions on this so far? Okay. Okay. I think I skipped one. Yes. Okay. So another injury that can occur at the knee are overuse injuries. And so, the knee, even though it's designed to only be a hinge joint, the knee kind of goes through a lot. And so a lot of times you have a lot of kind of, oblique forces or forces that are applied at the knee that are not really natural. And so one kind of big example of this is a condition known as breaststroker's knee. Okay. And so if you've ever watched someone do the breaststroke, if you're watching the Olympics at all this summer, you'll know that there's a part of the breaststroke where your knee kind of like, kind of kicks out, but you're kind of bringing your legs otherwise close together. And so that actually places a lot of strain on your MCL, right? So you can kind of see it in this figure a little bit. And so you can see here that the legs are kind of moving, kind of rotating inwards, while the foot is kind of still kind of rotated out that way, right? And so that places a lot of stress on your MCL, which is kind of the ligament that's on the inside of your knee, okay? And so even though it's not as traumatic as having a 300-pound person just kind of strike you from the outside, if you do this enough, especially for swimmers that kind of train as much as they do, it can add to a lot of fatigue and a lot of kind of micro damage to the MCL, okay? And so it can cause a lot of pain and a lot of discomfort in that area, okay? Another common injury for overuse is called shin splints, okay? And so shin splints are very common for track and field athletes, people that are kind of putting a lot of kind of very high stresses through their legs as either sprinting or jumping or what they usually do, okay? And this is usually microfractures in the tibia or the fibula within the leg itself, okay? All right, and another really interesting one that, is still being researched because it's not too common is what's known as patellofemoral pain syndrome. And so this is kind of swelling and pain in your patella, kind of, near the femur. And so the cause of this is still kind of being researched, but, it is starting to become a thing that's being, Okay, and then the last part of the body that we'll go through is the ankle. And so the ankle is probably the most sprained joint in the whole body. And so, you've probably sprained your ankle at least once in your life. If you play sports, you certainly have. Or if you just are clumsy like me and you just walk downstairs weirdly, you'll sprain your ankle like that too. And so, the ankle is another one of those joints that's held together by a lot of ligaments. And so if you stretch your ankle in a certain way, then those ligaments can get stretched and cause pain, which is probably associated with an ankle sprain. Okay. Overuse injuries, we've kind of already talked about this. The Achilles is a really important tendon in the back of your leg. It's responsible primarily for plantar flexion of your foot, but that can also get hurt through a lot of overuse as well. Okay. And another very interesting one are, there's a lot of conditions that kind of fit under this umbrella, but I've kind of just grouped them all into one. And those are what I call alignment anomalies. Okay. So there's a specific alignment of your bones and your joints that kind of, leads to the lowest amount of stress. Okay. We talked a little bit about that today in terms of the hip joint. But if you have kind of bow knees or your knees kind of bend outwards, that can put a lot of kind of, unnatural and high stress on your knees and your ankles, which can cause, a lot of pain over time as well. Okay. All right. Any final questions on this before we wrap it up for today? Okay. All right. So that's all we got time for today. And so when we come back on Wednesday, we'll talk about the spine. So thank you guys for coming today. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day, and I will see you on Wednesday. What up?
220, right?
A second?
Your office number is 220?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. Mhm. Yeah, I'm going back there right now, so you can just follow me in my office. Yeah. I need one for myself.